When we speak of self-improvement, we often imagine an ascent, a linear progression towards some idealized version of ourselves, yet much of what is called self-improvement today is less a journey of the soul and more a carefully crafted illusion of progress. One must understand that the psyche does not evolve merely by accumulating words, techniques, or slogans. In fact, the danger lies precisely here. The ego becomes enamored not with transformation, but with the appearance of transformation. It builds a polished identity, the improving one, the evolving one, the disciplined one, and in doing so, it hides from the deeper, more uncomfortable truths of the unconscious. Many people drown themselves in motivational content because it allows them to avoid confronting the inner conflict, the shadow that demands real change. The dark side of self-improvement is that it can seduce the individual into spiritual stagnation while convincing them they are moving forward. And the more refined this illusion becomes, the harder it is for one to discern between authentic development and psychological compensation. Real growth begins not with positive statements or heroic resolutions, but with a sober recognition of one's own divided nature. Without this recognition, the project of self-improvement collapses into merely another expression of the ego's desire for control, comfort, and superiority. Thus, before we can speak of progress, we must first expose the subtle trap that keeps countless individuals busy, inspired, and utterly unchanged. When an individual repeats affirmations without the anchoring force of disciplined action, he enters what I would call a psychic delusion, a split between the conscious intention and the unconscious reality. Affirmations, in their modern form, are often attempts to override the deeper, unresolved contents of the psyche through sheer insistence. But the unconscious does not obey commands. It reveals itself only through lived truth, not spoken wishfulness. When a person says, "I am strong, I am capable," yet behaves weakly and avoids his responsibilities, the psyche senses the discrepancy. This incongruence creates tension, a widening gap between who one declares oneself to be and who one actually is. And the ego, rather than confronting this gap, often doubles down on the illusion, seeking more books, louder motivational speeches, more elaborate visions of the future, all in the hope of drowning out the inner voice that whispers, "This is not who you are." In such a state, self-improvement becomes an escape from self-knowledge. The individual constructs a facade of growth precisely because he fears what true introspection might reveal. Affirmations, when used as substitutes for discipline, become spiritual narcotics. They soothe the ego while the deeper wounds of the psyche remain untouched. A person caught in this cycle believes he is progressing, but he is merely decorating the walls of an inner prison he refuses to examine. What is required is the courage to face one's contradictions, because only when the conscious mind admits its failure to act does the possibility of genuine transformation emerge. Discipline is not merely a behavioral strategy. It is the process through which the conscious mind aligns itself with the unconscious truth. And without this alignment, every affirmation remains a hollow proclamation, echoing uselessly through the chambers of an unexamined soul. One of the most curious phenomena of our age is the endless consumption of information under the guise of personal development. Individuals sit for hours absorbing motivational videos, psychological insights, and success strategies, believing they are ascending toward a higher state of being. Yet, the psyche does not evolve merely by exposure to knowledge. It evolves through confrontation, experience, and the integration of what is learned into the fabric of one's life. When learning becomes a passive ritual, an endless stream of stimulation unaccompanied by action, it no longer serves growth, it serves avoidance. And avoidance is always the work of the shadow. This consumption loop is, in psychological terms, a form of dissociation. It allows the individual to remain at a safe distance from the difficult tasks of transformation. Instead of confronting their inadequacies, they watch others speak of strength. Instead of developing discipline, they observe others display it. Instead of facing their inner fragmentation, they drown themselves in external voices. The unconscious, meanwhile, grows restless. It demands expression through action, not through spectatorship. But as long as the ego feels busy with improvement, even if this improvement is purely intellectual, it convinces itself that change is happening. This is the most subtle deception of all, the illusion of progress. There is also a deeper psychological mechanism at play. When one consumes large amounts of inspiring content, the psyche experiences a vicarious sense of accomplishment. The brain produces the emotional impression of growth without the reality of it. This surrogate sense of achievement is dangerously seductive because it masks the actual stagnation of the individual's life. The person feels enlightened while their circumstances remain unchanged. And each additional video reinforces this cycle, substituting reflection for action, motion for meaning, and knowledge for embodiment. True growth demands that the individual draw a line between learning and living, between inspiration and implementation. Without that distinction, the quest for self-improvement becomes a perpetual rehearsal for a performance that never takes place. Wisdom that is not enacted becomes a burden on the soul, not a blessing. Knowledge accumulates but does not incarnate. And the individual, believing himself enriched, becomes increasingly estranged from the authentic experience of transformation that only action bold, imperfect, and often uncomfortable can bring. There exists within the human psyche a persistent fantasy, a psychological mirage that I would call the someday illusion. It is the belief that transformation will occur at some indefinite point in the future, when circumstances align, when motivation returns, when clarity appears, when the soul feels ready. But readiness is seldom a product of waiting. It is the fruit of engagement with reality. The problem with someday is that it relocates the burden of change away from the present moment where life is actually lived and deposits it into a hypothetical future that never arrives. One postpones action not because the time is unsuitable, but because the unconscious resists the confrontation that action demands. It is important to understand that the psyche speaks through symbols, not calendars. When one continually defers change, it is rarely due to external obstacles. More often, it is an expression of inner conflict, a refusal to face the shadow contents that true transformation would inevitably expose. To take action is to risk failure, to confront inadequacy, to challenge the ego's constructed image. Therefore, the ego devises an elegant defense, the promise of eventual transformation. I will begin when I feel stronger, when I am more confident, when life becomes less chaotic. These are not strategic considerations, they are psychological evasions. The someday illusion is thus a form of psychic paralysis. It allows the individual to maintain the belief that they are on the path to growth, while simultaneously avoiding the discomfort of actually walking it. The unconscious, however, does not participate in these fantasies. Each postponed decision sends a message deeper into the psyche that one is unwilling to act, unwilling to bear responsibility, unwilling to confront oneself. And over time, the soul internalizes this message. Potential withers. Initiative fades. The individual becomes a spectator to their own life, trapped between grand visions of the future and the inertia of the present. Consider this. Transformation is not a future event. It is the result of a present act. The most profound psychological shifts do not wait for ideal conditions. They begin in the midst of uncertainty, ambivalence, and even fear. It is often the first small step, taken imperfectly, that mobilizes the unconscious and awakens dormant energies. In that moment, one discovers that change does not happen someday. It happens now or not at all. Tomorrow cannot save the individual who refuses to act today. The future depends entirely upon the courage one summons in the present. And courage, unlike inspiration, cannot be postponed. One of the most insidious dangers in the modern pursuit of self-improvement is the construction of what I might call a secondary identity, an ego image built not upon actual inner change, but upon the idea of inner change. The ego, being inherently opportunistic, quickly learns to appropriate even noble aspirations for its own preservation. Thus, the individual begins to describe himself as someone on a growth journey, working on his mindset, or becoming his highest self. These phrases, while seemingly benign, can conceal a profound psychological defense, the ego's need to appear transformed without undergoing the painful work that true transformation requires. The psyche is often far more intelligent than the conscious mind assumes. When a person begins to label themselves as a self-improving individual, this label can become a subtle refuge from the demands of authenticity. Instead of confronting the shadow, those forgotten, rejected, or unintegrated aspects of the personality, the individual fortifies a polished persona of progress. In psychological terms, this is a form of inflation, the expansion of the ego beyond its legitimate boundaries. And whenever the ego inflates, the shadow deepens correspondingly. What appears outwardly as confidence becomes inwardly a fragile facade, easily shattered by life's inevitable challenges. The tragedy of this ego trap is that it replaces genuine evolution with performance. One may read extensively, speak eloquently about personal growth, and even inspire others, while remaining internally unchanged. The self-improvement identity becomes a mask worn so consistently that the individual forgets it is a mask at all. This is spiritual stagnation disguised as advancement. The more invested the ego becomes in this image, the less willing it is to acknowledge weakness, uncertainty, or failure, the very experiences necessary for psychological integration. We must remember that the true path of development is not linear, nor is it glamorous. It requires humility, self-confrontation, and a willingness to dismantle one's own illusions. To grow, one must allow the personality to be seen not only in its aspirations, but in its contradictions. Without this honesty, the self-improver identity becomes a prison, a beautifully decorated one, perhaps, but a prison nonetheless. The individual becomes trapped in a perpetual performance, unable to admit that beneath the rhetoric of growth lies an unresolved psyche still yearning for authenticity. The challenge, therefore, is to relinquish the seductive identity of the one who improves and instead become the one who acts, who feels, who faces the shadow, who accepts responsibility for the depths within. Only then does self-improvement cease to be a theatrical display for the ego and become, instead, a genuine encounter with the self, the totality of who one is and who one is capable of becoming. There is a peculiar phenomenon in the human psyche, the tendency to substitute emotional stimulation for genuine psychological development. Many individuals today seek out constant bursts of motivational energy, powerful speeches, inspiring messages, emotional crescendos, believing these experiences bring them closer to transformation. Yet, one must understand that emotional excitation, while vivid and intoxicating, often serves as a momentary inflation of the ego rather than a deepening of the self. It grants the illusion of forward movement, even though the individual has not taken a single step inward or outward. In this way, motivation becomes not a catalyst for change, but a subtle form of psychological entertainment. The difference between transformation and stimulation is profound. Stimulation acts upon the surface of the psyche, generating temporary feelings of power or possibility. It is akin to a flame that flares brightly but quickly exhausts itself. Transformation, however, requires the slow and deliberate descent into one's own depths. It asks that we confront the patterns that bind us, the fears we conceal, the desires we repress, and the truths we avoid. This work is quiet, often uncomfortable, and rarely dramatic. It does not provide the exhilaration that motivational entertainment offers. And for that reason, the ego prefers the latter. It is far less demanding. When the individual becomes dependent upon motivational content, he mistakes emotional uplift for psychological insight. He experiences a brief surge of enthusiasm and interprets this as evidence of growth. Yet enthusiasm evaporates, and without disciplined action or introspection, nothing has changed within. This cycle mirrors addiction. The psyche becomes conditioned to seek increasingly intense stimuli to compensate for the absence of real progress. Over time, the individual may find that no amount of motivational energy is sufficient to overcome the inertia of an unresolved inner life. This dependency is dangerous because it shields the individual from the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow does not yield to emotion, it yields to awareness, courage, and honest labor. Emotional highs, if not followed by reflective action, merely distract the conscious mind from the deeper work that remains undone. They create a rhythm of temporary optimism followed by inevitable disappointment, which then drives the person to seek even more stimulation. Thus, the individual becomes trapped in a cycle of emotional consumption rather than psychological maturation. The tragedy of this pattern is that motivation could serve a valuable purpose if used sparingly as a spark to illuminate the path, not as the path itself. But when motivation becomes a substitute for introspection, discipline, and real decision-making, it weakens the individual instead of strengthening him. Growth requires the individual to endure discomfort, uncertainty, and the slow, patient unfolding of inner integration. No emotional speech, however inspiring, can accomplish this work on one's behalf. To break this cycle, one must shift from seeking emotional stimulation to building psychological stability. The psyche flourishes not through constant excitement, but through the establishment of meaningful habits, honest reflection, and consistent engagement with life. Only then does motivation become what it was meant to be, a companion to transformation, not a distraction from it. And only then does the individual begin to encounter the deeper sources of strength that arise not from external voices, but from within the self. If we are to escape the deceptive cycle of passive self-improvement, we must fundamentally reevaluate the relationship between knowledge and action within the psyche. Knowledge, by itself, is inert. It remains suspended in the mind like unassimilated food that nourishes neither body nor spirit. Only through action real, tangible engagement with the world does knowledge become integrated into the personality and transformed into wisdom. This process of integration is what gives structure and weight to the self. Without it, the psyche becomes bloated with theories, aspirations, and ideals that never descend from abstraction into lived reality. To counteract the inflation of the ego that arises from passive consumption, one must adopt a discipline principle I will call the doer ratio. The idea that for every unit of learning, there must be a greater unit of doing. Symbolically, this is an act of psychic grounding. It draws the inflated contents of the mind downward into the domain of embodiment. When you read for 10 minutes and then act for 30, you are not merely practicing efficiency. You are aligning the conscious mind with the unconscious will. You are telling the psyche, I am not here to fantasize about transformation. I am here to participate in it. Action has a remarkable alchemical quality. When one takes even the smallest step toward a goal, the unconscious responds. It releases new energy, new insights, new possibilities that were previously inaccessible. Action activates dormant parts of the psyche in a way that mere contemplation cannot. Conversely, when one refuses to act, the unconscious interprets this passivity as fear or avoidance. Potential energy decays into self-doubt, and the individual becomes increasingly disconnected from his own capacities. In many cases, the paralysis of the modern individual is not due to a lack of knowledge, but a lack of psychological embodiment. He knows far more than he practices, and this imbalance fragments the psyche. The conscious mind becomes burdened with ideals it does not live up to, and the unconscious grows resentful at being ignored. This inner division expresses itself as anxiety, procrastination, and a pervasive sense of inadequacy. The doer ratio serves as a bridge between these two psychic realms. It asks the individual to restore harmony by ensuring that what is known intellectually is honored behaviorally. Perhaps the most important insight here is that action is not merely an external behavior, it is a symbolic gesture. Every act declares to the unconscious, I am willing to confront reality. It is this confrontation that awakens the forces within the psyche responsible for genuine transformation. Without it, the individual remains suspended in a world of theory, comfortably informed, yet existentially unchanged. Thus, the path forward is neither to accumulate more ideas, nor to seek more emotional stimulation. It is to take responsibility for the knowledge one already possesses, to begin where one stands, to act even clumsily or imperfectly, rather than wait for the illusion of readiness. For it is not the perfect plan that liberates the individual from stagnation, but the courageous act that breaks the chains of inertia. And through such acts, repeated faithfully, the personality begins to unify, strengthen, and evolve into something more whole. When we consider the notion of mastery, we must look beyond the superficial understanding commonly attached to the word. Mastery is not the accumulation of techniques, nor is it the attainment of some socially approved standard of competence. Rather, mastery represents a mode of being a sustained relationship with one's inner and outer worlds. It is a commitment to the lifelong process of shaping the psyche into coherence, integrity, and authenticity. In this sense, self-improvement cannot be treated as a hobby, something pursued intermittently and abandoned when inconvenient, for the psyche does not evolve through sporadic attention. It requires constancy, devotion, and a willingness to confront the self across the seasons of one's life. Modern individuals often approach personal growth as though it were a series of tasks to be completed, a book to finish, a challenge to endure, a habit to adopt. While these may have practical value, they risk reducing the journey of individuation to a checklist. The psyche does not respond well to such mechanistic approaches. It moves according to the rhythm of symbols, dreams, shadows, and emerging insights, none of which adhere to the rigid timetables the conscious mind prefers. Mastery demands patience and a form of humility, for it acknowledges that one is in dialogue with forces far older and deeper than the ego. To live this way is to understand that one does not complete self-improvement. One is continually shaped by it. Much of our suffering arises from the false distinction we draw between who we are in moments of discipline and who we are in moments of forgetfulness. The individual who views self-improvement as a temporary project is like a person who waters a plant only when he feels inspired. The plant cannot survive such inconsistency, and neither can the psyche. Growth is not the result of dramatic bursts of effort, but of steady, conscious engagement with the task of living. It is the small, repeated acts, the honest conversation, the disciplined choice, the reflective pause that gradually forge a unified personality. When one adopts self-improvement as a way of life, something profound occurs. The ego, which seeks quick results and external validation, begins to relinquish control. In its place emerges a deeper orientation toward meaning rather than achievement. Life becomes less about becoming impressive and more about becoming whole. This is the essence of individuation, the gradual alignment of conscious and unconscious elements into a harmonious totality. Such harmony cannot be attained through enthusiasm alone. It requires endurance, honesty, and a willingness to encounter one's shadow again and again. Mastery also involves recognizing that the outer world is a mirror of the inner. Discipline in work, relationships, and health is not separate from psychological development. It is an extension of it. Every routine maintained, every promise kept, every difficult task completed contributes to the strengthening of the psyche. One does not practice discipline merely to achieve external goals, but to cultivate inner order. The true measure of progress, then, is not found in accolades or accomplishments, but in the increasing clarity with which one perceives oneself and the world. In this way, self-improvement ceases to be an escape from life and becomes a deeper engagement with it. It transforms from an occasional pursuit into a form of reverence, an ongoing dialogue with the self, a willingness to listen, and a readiness to act. Through such devotion, the individual moves gradually toward mastery, not as a destination, but as a lived expression of inner alignment and purpose. As we conclude this exploration, it is essential to recognize that the true danger of modern self-improvement lies not in its ideals, but in the distance that often grows between those ideals and the lived reality of the individual. One may dream endlessly of a better life, a stronger character, a clearer mind, yet dreams alone do not bring forth transformation. They are symbolic representations of the potential within the psyche. Valuable, yes, but powerless unless integrated through conscious effort. Dreams show us what might be. Actions determine what will be. To remain a dreamer without becoming a doer is to dwell eternally in the realm of possibility while forfeiting the realm of becoming. The unconscious holds within it vast reserves of energy, creativity, and resilience. But it does not release these resources to those who merely fantasize about growth. It responds only to those who enter into dialogue with life, who take the first uncertain step, who confront their fears, who reveal their vulnerabilities, who act despite not feeling ready. Every action taken in earnest becomes a signal to the unconscious, a declaration of willingness. And with each such signal, the psyche reorganizes itself around a more integrated, more coherent identity. There is a profound psychological truth here. The self supports those who support their own becoming. When an individual aligns intention with behavior, a deep inner harmony begins to emerge. The conflict between who one imagines oneself to be and who one actually is begins to dissolve. The personality gains weight, substance, and authenticity. Life stops feeling like an endless rehearsal and begins to resemble a meaningful performance grounded in responsibility rather than fantasy. Yet to reach this state, one must relinquish the seductive comfort of passive aspiration. It is easier, infinitely easier, to dream of a stronger self than to build one. It is easier to speak of discipline than to embody it. It is easier to consume wisdom than to translate it into lived experience. But the psyche cares little for ease. It seeks wholeness. And wholeness can only be achieved by confronting the reality of one's life with unwavering honesty and deliberate action. Therefore, let this be the final invitation. Step out of abstraction and into embodiment. Let your actions carry the weight of your intentions. Allow the smallest gesture of discipline to become a sacred act. Let every decision, however minor, serve as a testament to your commitment to growth. In doing so, you bridge the gap between dream and reality, between ego and self, between who you have been and who you are capable of becoming. For transformation is not the privilege of the gifted, nor the result of inspiration alone. It is the daily choice to live in accordance with one's deeper truth. And when you choose action, consistent, grounded, imperfect action, you cease to be merely a dreamer in the landscape of your psyche. You become the architect of your own becoming.